In the grand history of the Crusades, few figures stand as tall as King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. A boy king who ascended the throne at just 13, Baldwin was no ordinary ruler. He was a warrior, a visionary, and a leader whose name echoed through history despite suffering from a crippling disease, leprosy. But was Baldwin IV merely a tragic figure doomed to an early death, or was he the king who defied fate and transformed Jerusalem forever? His story is one of resilience, courage, and strategic brilliance in the face of insurmountable odds. Chapter 1: The Birth of a Warrior King. A cold wind swept through the great halls of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. The year was 1161, and a hushed tension filled the chamber as Queen Agnes of Courtenay struggled through the pains of childbirth. In the candlelit room, the midwives whispered prayers, their voices trembling. They knew that the fate of Jerusalem hung on the survival of this one child, the heir to the throne. A destiny sealed in blood. From the moment he took his first breath, Baldwin was not just a boy, he was a symbol of hope for the Christian kingdom surrounded by powerful Muslim forces. His father, King Amalric I, ruled with wisdom, but even he feared for the future. The Crusader states were fragile, constantly threatened by the growing power of Saladin, the brilliant military leader rising in the east. The young prince was not like other children. By the age of 5, he showed signs of intelligence far beyond his years. He could recite entire passages from religious texts, strategize mock battles with his tutors, and had a fascination for war tactics that alarmed even the hardened knights in the kingdom. The first signs of tragedy, but fate had its own cruel plans. By the time Baldwin was 9 years old, his caretakers noticed something odd. He could not feel pain in his right arm. At first, they dismissed it as a minor ailment, but as the months passed, the condition worsened. Baldwin would injure himself without realizing it. His hand would burn on candle flames, and he would not react. The court physician's face turned pale the day he finally confirmed their worst fears. Baldwin IV had leprosy. The news was devastating. Leprosy was seen as a curse, a divine punishment, and it was fatal. The people whispered that Jerusalem was doomed. How could a leper rule a kingdom surrounded by war-hardened enemies? What happens next? Chapter 2: The Leper King rises. The torches flickered in the grand hall of the palace. The kingdom was silent, yet whispers filled every corner. Baldwin IV, the boy destined to rule, had been marked by an incurable disease. Some called it divine punishment, others called it fate. But one thing was certain: the kingdom needed a king, and this boy, despite his affliction, was the only heir. The burden of leprosy, Baldwin's condition, was kept a secret for as long as possible, but the truth could not be hidden forever. As his body slowly deteriorated, his spirit only grew stronger. His tutor, William of Tyre, a highly respected scholar, documented Baldwin's resilience. Despite the affliction of his body, Baldwin showed extraordinary strength of will. He possessed the mind of a ruler and the heart of a warrior. While other boys played, Baldwin studied. He pored over military texts, learned war strategies, and developed a keen understanding of state affairs. His father, King Amalric I, ensured he was trained in swordsmanship, though many doubted Baldwin's ability to fight. But Baldwin was not a boy who accepted defeat. One day, during a training session, he shocked everyone. He challenged a full-grown knight to a duel. The court laughed. How could a sickly prince fight a battle-hardened warrior? But Baldwin's mind was sharp. He used speed and intelligence instead of brute force, evading his opponent's strikes until he found an opening. With a sudden move, he disarmed the knight. The court fell silent. Baldwin IV was not weak. He was a warrior. In 1174, when Baldwin was just 13 years old, his father, King Amalric I, fell ill and died. The kingdom erupted into chaos. Who would rule? Many nobles argued that Baldwin's leprosy made him unfit to wear the crown. They feared that a dying boy could not defend Jerusalem from the rising threat of Saladin, the formidable Muslim leader who had already begun uniting the Islamic world under his banner. But Baldwin refused to be cast aside. The kingdom needed a leader, and he was ready to be that leader. On a cold autumn morning, in the grand cathedral of the Holy Sepulchre, Baldwin IV was crowned King of Jerusalem. Despite his trembling hands and the pain that racked his body, he stood tall as the golden crown was placed upon his head. He was no longer just a sickly boy, he was the ruler of the most sacred kingdom on earth. A kingdom in peril. No sooner had Baldwin IV been crowned than war loomed on the horizon. Salah ad-Din was preparing to march on Jerusalem. The nobles doubted Baldwin's ability to command an army, but the young king knew that the only way to prove himself was on the battlefield. And so, he did the unthinkable. Despite the pain eating away at his body, Baldwin IV donned his armor, mounted his warhorse, and led his knights into battle. What happened next would shock the world. What happens next? Chapter 3: The Warrior King vs. Salah ad-Din. The desert sun blazed like molten gold over the battlefield. Dust swirled as thousands of warriors stood at the ready. On one side, the mighty forces of Salah ad-Din, veteran soldiers, elite Mamluks, and war-hardened cavalry, stretched across the horizon. On the other, the outnumbered Crusader army, banners of the cross fluttering in the scorching wind. At the center of it all, clad in gleaming armor, sat Baldwin IV, the leper king. His body was failing, but his spirit was stronger than ever. He tightened his grip on his sword. There was no turning back. This was his kingdom, his fight, his destiny. The rise of Salah ad-Din. Before the battle began, Baldwin IV's advisors urged him to seek peace with Salah ad-Din. The Muslim leader was a brilliant strategist who had united much of the Islamic world under his rule. He was known for his tactical brilliance, swift cavalry movements, and ability to outmaneuver his enemies. But Baldwin knew something the others did not. Salah ad-Din had weaknesses. Despite his military genius, Salah ad-Din had never faced Baldwin IV directly in battle. The young king had studied his enemy's movements, and he was about to turn Salah ad-Din's own strategy against him. The Battle of Montgizard, Baldwin's greatest victory in 1177, Salah ad-Din launched a massive invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, confident that Baldwin IV would be too weak to resist. But the leper king had other plans. Baldwin gathered his forces and led a daring counterattack at Montgizard, a battle that would go down in history. Despite being outnumbered 10-1, Baldwin personally led his knights in a devastating charge, catching Salah ad-Din's army off guard. His body burned with pain, but he refused to yield. The Crusader cavalry smashed into the enemy lines, cutting through the ranks like a storm. Salah ad-Din's forces, unprepared for such a bold assault, began to break apart. Then came the moment that changed history. As the battle raged, Baldwin IV, still only 16 years old, rode straight into the heart of the enemy army. His sword flashed like lightning as he fought, his presence inspiring his men to fight harder. Salah ad-Din, seeing his army falling into chaos, had no choice but to flee. The impossible had happened. The leper king had crushed the greatest Muslim general of the era. The cost of victory. Though Baldwin IV had won a glorious victory, the battle had taken a terrible toll on his body. The strain of combat, the heat, and his worsening illness left him physically broken. His fingers had begun to decay, his face was covered in wounds, and his strength was fading. The nobles whispered in the corridors of the palace, "How long could a dying king hold the throne?" But Baldwin refused to surrender to fate. Despite the pain, despite the disease eating away at his flesh, he prepared for war once more. Because he knew one thing for certain, Salah ad-Din would return. What happens next? Chapter 4: The Last Stand of the Leper King. The once mighty King Baldwin IV now struggled to move. His body, ravaged by leprosy, was failing him, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He sat atop his throne in Jerusalem, gazing out at the golden domes of the holy city. War was coming once again. Salah ad-Din was gathering his forces, stronger than ever, determined to seize Jerusalem. Baldwin knew this would be his last battle. But if he was to die, he would die as he had always lived, a warrior king. He gripped the hilt of his sword and took a deep breath. The time had come. The siege of Jerusalem begins. In 1183, Salah ad-Din returned with an army even larger than before. The Muslim general had learned from his mistakes. He knew Baldwin IV was a brilliant strategist, but now, the king's body was failing him. The city trembled as Salah ad-Din's massive army marched toward the holy city. Tens of thousands of warriors, siege engines, and elite cavalry stood ready to bring down the walls of Jerusalem. Baldwin's advisors begged him to step aside. "You are too weak, my king. Let others lead the battle." But Baldwin IV refused. He ordered his men to bring his horse and armor. If this was to be the end, he would meet it on the battlefield. The impossible defense. The siege engines roared as giant stones smashed into the walls of Jerusalem. Arrows darkened the sky. The defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, fought desperately to hold the city. And then, Baldwin IV did the unthinkable. He led a counterattack. Despite his crippling disease, he rode at the head of his knights, charging out of the gates of Jerusalem directly into the enemy ranks. The sight was unbelievable. The enemy soldiers, seeing a half-dead king charging toward them, hesitated for a crucial moment. That hesitation turned the tide of battle. With a cry that echoed across the battlefield, Baldwin IV plunged into the fight. His sword flashed in the sunlight, his men rallying behind him. The enemy reeled from the unexpected assault. For a moment, it seemed like a miracle. Baldwin IV, dying and in agony, had once again defied the impossible. The final stand, but miracles do not last forever. Baldwin's body could no longer endure the strain. As the battle raged, he collapsed. His men rushed to protect him, dragging him from the battlefield. The leper king had fought his last fight. The defenders, inspired by his bravery, fought on with renewed fury. Against all odds, the Crusaders held Jerusalem. But Baldwin IV knew the truth. His time had come. The death of a legend in 1185, Baldwin IV, the leper king, took his final breath. He had ruled against all odds, outwitted one of the greatest generals in history, and defied fate itself. As he was laid to rest, Jerusalem mourned. They had lost their king, but they would never forget his courage, his brilliance, and his will to fight against the impossible. And Salah ad-Din? He would return 2 years later, this time with no Baldwin IV to stop him. But that is another story. The legacy of the leper king. Though Baldwin IV died young, his legend lived on. He was the king who defied death, the warrior who fought while his body failed him, the strategist who outwitted Salah ad-Din. History remembers many kings, but few like Baldwin IV. He was the king who never surrendered. What happens next?